I mentioned last time that I would, in the run-up to Christmas, move away from Bible passages and tell some stories of people I've had the privilege of meeting. I mentioned Dr. Martyn Lloyd-Jones last time. I think one of the most remarkable people I've ever met was a guy called Dr. Krian Sak from Thailand. I first met him at a conference where I was speaking in Dallas, Texas. I'd heard about him just before I went and was hoping I might meet him. And sure enough, he actually approached me in the crowd and said he'd read my book, Restoration in the Church. So I was greatly blessed, and we had some time in his hotel room. And he told me his story. He'd been in Australia, I think it was Adelaide, on a government-funded PhD, economics PhD, being prepared for government, I think. And while there was brought alongside a really lovely believer, a Christian. And one day he approached him and said, "Come on, what is it with you?" And the outcome was this guy led him to Christ. He told me the story that he had a wonderful conversion. And a few weeks later, he just came home one evening to his room, and the room was filled with light and glory. And he was overwhelmed with the presence of God, and found himself speaking in tongues, just overwhelmed. And God spoke to him and said he was calling him, and he was called to plant a church in every region of Thailand. And he said that it was late at night, and he went to the door of the room where this guy who'd led him to Christ was, and he said he could barely stop speaking in tongues, overwhelmed. And this guy that he looked up to so much said, "What's happened to you?" And he said, "I don't really know." He said, "Who laid hands on you?" He said, "Sorry, what does that mean?" And he said, Don't develop this anymore. I'll speak to you tomorrow." And the next day he saw him and gave him a number of books warning Krian Sak against being filled with the Spirit, speaking with tongues. He was from a different kind of Christian perspective, sadly. But Krian Sak told me, I read the books, but I couldn't see in any of them any reason why I should deny what had happened to me. He pressed on, and he was in Australia for a while, and then he came back to Thailand, and he started meetings. He said the very first meeting, he dragged his family and I believe one neighbour into a very small meeting in a house. And he said from that day, he had never had a meeting where no one had been saved. And he then spoke at the conference. It was electrifying. In fact, when he preached on John 4, and it was overwhelming. I was completely undone by his preaching. When he finished, I was just reduced to tears. I felt like a backslidden teenager, though I was one of the preachers at the conference. It was absolutely stunning. And I couldn't even talk about the experience without weeping. When I came back to Brighton, we're having some prayer meetings at the church there, and I just telling what happened, I began to weep. We had some electric prayer meetings. It just seemed like God was on him and with him. He invited me to speak at his church in Bangkok. I went out. By that time, they'd grown a very large church, and they'd bought a multi-story car park and made a meeting room in one of the levels. And it was packed. I had 5 meetings that day, and I preached for 3 of them. And he said, "I'll have mercy on my English friend. I'll get one of my companions to do the other 2 services." In fact, he spoke to leaders and didn't finish till about 10 o'clock that night. 120 came forward for salvation that Sunday. Not because Terry Virgo's a great evangelist, but that's the kind of number they were seeing every week. I think his summing up words at the end of my preach were probably the electricity that pulled people forward. It was such a blessing to meet this mighty man. He came over to us in the UK and spoke at a leaders' meeting at the Brighton Centre. And while he was preaching, he said, "Is there a place called," and he could see it and spelt it out, Coventry. And he said, "I see God taking you there, and God's going to meet with you there." And of course, Coventry is right next to Stoneleigh, and we were about to start Stoneleigh the following year. He said, "God's going to come on you there." And then he invited people to come forward who felt called to church planting, and many Many knew not only they were called, but knew the town. So many could tell stories of their encounters with Criansack. What a mighty man. What a tremendous privilege to be exposed to such incredible New Testament Christianity. It did us good. It did a great thing amongst us in New Frontiers. I'll tell you some more stories. It was great to meet John Wimber.